This
Can
conference will now be recorded.
I ask a question? Hello?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. I have a question. Like, I don't know how to frame it actually, but if we take an example of a system, like for a university, maybe required to present the user of the system with the display of number of students enrolled in each class. That is a system requirement, and this is a functional requirement, right? And
yes, this is a functional requirement.
And how update the number needs to be is a non-functional requirement, right?
How uptake
the numbers needs to be.
Can you please repeat the second statement? How
up to date?
Okay, that is not up to date is also basically not a non-functional requirement. Up to date, obviously the system need to be updated on a regular basis. So basically this. So when we talk about the non-functionalities, for example, the non-functional requirement, how many users parallelly can use this particular system at a time?
Yeah.
So which talks about that the non-functional requirement. And then when about the security, how secure the system is in terms of like when like anyone can break that system, and basically the chance of taking the data, the student data or whatever. So that security becomes a non-functional requirement. So the data getting up to date is maybe data refresh, that all the things which basically comes under the data related requirements, the data management related requirements, or data related requirements.
So data management related requirement is a functional requirement or a non-functional requirement?
It's basically, it's again, we can put it under a separate category of the things, the separate category of the things, because so in terms of handling the data, so the database team would be working on it and getting the data up to date. Again, the data refresh would be happening. So continuous basis, the data refresh would be like frequently the data refresh would be happening. So that's where that would come under more in lines of with the data related requirements. So in order for putting the data, so what all the details that we need to capture, that would come under the functional requirements. That would again come under the functional requirements.
So do we mention that in the business requirement document about the
yes.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So moving on to what we discussed yesterday. So do you see my screen? You all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Right. So yesterday we were talking about how do we arrive at these non-functional requirements. So obviously, like the business says, the system should be functioning well, system should perform well, the system can be enhanced or changed easily. So these are the requirements from the business perspective, and from the user perspective, the user has a number of concerns. If you put down those things into the requirement, you come up with the non-functional requirement. So we also talked about the classification of the requirements. So whether it is a functional or a non-functional requirement. So those things we have done some of the examples we talked about already. And today I'm going to talk about how to document these non-functional requirements, because these are not the functionalities just which has a straightforward approach. So these are more the quality attributes of the system. These things are more the quality attributes of the system. How do we document these quality attributes of the system? How do we document these quality attributes of the system? So the business need says that the system should be available during working hours and non-working hours. The system should be available during working hours and non-working hours. The objective is the availability of the application. And we talk about metrics or the performance data. So availability is we expect the system to be up and running 24/7, 365 days. As like that's just one of the requirements which talks about the availability. But how do we measure it? How do we document it? So when we have to document that requirement, number of planned outages per month or per year. How many planned outages per month or per year? Number of unplanned outages per month or per year. Number of unplanned outages per month or per year. Number of hours per outage. So if the system goes down, how many hours it goes down? The number of hours per outage. So this is some criteria so that we would be defining under the non-functional requirement, so that once the system is up and running, so we measure these things and check whether all those things are in line with what are the metrics that we identified earlier. What are the metrics that we identified earlier? So number of planned outages per month or per year. So how many planned system downtime? Outage is nothing but the downtime. So how many such planned outages that we have in a month or a year? Number of unplanned outages, the acceptable unplanned outages, and number of hours per outage. Availability, which also be looked at, to ability to restore all the transactions to a point in time prior to a failure. Ability to restore all the transaction to a point in time prior to a failure, whether the system has the capability to bring up all the transaction prior to a failure. The maximum time required to restore the configuration or session data, all the configs and the session data, the restoration of all the data. What would be the maximum time? What would be the maximum time it takes to restore all of the data, all of the transactions? So what would be the maximum time that it takes to restore that data? So that will also be like considered under the availability as a requirement. So whenever we document such requirement, we need to find out a matrix or a criteria which can be used to measure that quality attribute of that particular application. So for the availability, the quality attributes in terms of number of planned outages, unplanned outages, whether system has the capability to bring all the transactions to a point in time prior to a failure. What would be the maximum time to restore all of the data, configuration or session data, all of the data? What would be the maximum time it takes? So that would define the availability as a non-functional requirement. And like metrics would help us identifying the requirements in detail. And what do we do once the application is deployed? We check the metrics against the actual data and see, are we in line, or do we need to improve something, or do we need to have more support team, or do we need to like have more servers required? So that basically like once we compare the actual system when it is up and running with your requirements while you identify, then you can improve the system performance, availability, or the respective non-functional requirements. Then moving on to the efficiency of the application. So probably this is the one which is slightly easier compared to the other ones. So the business need says that the system should perform fast. The system should be performing fast. When we say the system should be performing fast, it talks about the response time and the capacity. It talks about the response time and the capacity. So response time for simple transactions, response time for medium transactions. So uh, response time for medium transactions, response time for complex transactions. So what is a medium, or what is a simple, what is a complex transaction? There is nothing like that simple, medium, complex. But we define the functional requirement into one of these three categories. Some of the requirements are the features as the simple set of requirement which may have 1 to 3 steps to complete. For example, the login functionality, so which will be completed in within 3 steps. So you launch the application, log into the application. So similarly, there are some transactions which may take more than 3 to 5 steps to complete. There are some things which would take 3 to 5 steps. So that is like medium transaction. There are something which takes greater than 5 steps, which we call it as complex transactions. So what would be the response time? I mean, the average time for doing a simple transaction. What would be the response time for doing a medium transaction? What would be the response time for doing a complex transaction? Simple, medium, and complex transaction. Simple, medium, and complex transaction. So we define certain like a number against a simple, medium, and complex transaction that becomes your requirement are related to efficiency of the application. And rather than doing it for every requirement, we categorize them into simple, medium, and complex, and we define the response times. And efficiency also have a different perspective, that is with regards to the capacity. How many people can use the system parallelly? Number of concurrent users, number of total users in a day, or maybe in a particular period, or during the working time in a day, and number of transactions supported per day. How many transactions the system can support per day. So that way, efficiency has a different perspective. Number of concurrent users supported by the system, number of total users would be using the system, number of transactions supported per day, number of transactions supported per day. So that way, when you talk about efficiency, so it talks about the response time. It also talks about the capacity of the application. And below, you can see the transaction category, simple, response time, SLA, like in seconds, that is 3 seconds, 6 seconds, and 10 seconds. That is just a random number. So like that, for every type of transaction, simple, medium, complex, we define some numbers, some time duration, so that once the system is up and running, based on our categorization, whether these transactions are taking more time. So we have some metrics to compare with. We have some metrics to compare with and see if it is taking more than the time. So we need to do some improvement with regards to like increasing the efficiency of the application. Is that clear?
Yes.
Others?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So then moving on to the performance, the performance matrix, something we if you want to compare. So these are two tables here in one, so on top and bottom to the same way, serial number and the transaction. The first one is for the internal people and the second one is for the external people. For example, if you take a banking system is used by the bank employees as well as customers like you and us. So you and me who would be using it, right? So obviously with regards to that particular application, what are the transactions that we do? The transactions are listed out there. And the use case referencing number, the other day we talked about the use case. For each requirement, there is a use case number. You mentioned those use case references. And the response time in milliseconds or microseconds or whatever. So that is defined for each and every transaction. When the internal peak load is total users is so and so, concurrent users is so and so, off peak time so and so many people are using, concurrent users are so many. So you will take an average time that would be put under the response time for the internal people. And similarly, you do exercise for the external people too. And you take an average of that, then define that this is the average time that we take for doing a particular transaction. So like that, you put similar transactions in both of the tables and you try to get the data for the internal people during the peak time, that is working day, especially like morning times, and then half peak time during the off peak time. So how the system response would be, you take an average time out of it, and that gives you a figure of like how the system is responding once the system is implemented and once it is used by the customer. You validate this information, so that you get to know whether you are able to or you are in line with whatever the plan that you have for the simple, medium, and complex transactions, the response time. Is that clear?
I just
So
have a quick
mhm,
question. is
Mhm.
all this documentation only can be done for a existing project, right? For a new project, how this is
No,
possible?
so this is so we need to come across with some metrics definitely for the new project as well. We need to come across with the metrics. So we can validate that metrics only when you have the system available up and running. We can validate that metrics only if the system is available up and running. But definitely you can basically come up with the metrics, and that metrics we try to match in our development environment and the development systems with the help of performance checks and all that. So that's why
Okay,
you
so
have the performance testing team, right? Yeah, performance testing
when
team.
the
You have different
performance
people.
testing is going on, that time only we can make this documentation, right?
Yeah, so basically these things we need to identify and define as requirements like any other requirements.
Okay.
So then, like while doing the development activity, while making sure the testing is done, these things
Mhm.
are verified in the testing environment with the performance systems or
Okay.
any other possible medium maybe. And once the system is up
Depends
and
on
running, we
the
can compare the real time terms, real time values.
yeah. Yeah. Okay, got it. Thank you.
All right, so moving on to the supportability. So like the organization says that the system should be supported all the time, 24 by 7, 365 days. We have the support team available even during the holidays or during the non-working hours. We support our application. For example, if you take banking transaction, so it is supported 25 by 7, 365 days. You can do a transaction. You can do a transaction at any time. You can do a transaction at any time. So that way, if you talk about the that way, if you talk about the supportability as one of the requirements for the system, which says that the system should be supported all the time. So if you talk about support as the maintenance activity, number of support calls expected during the month. If you want to measure it, the number of support calls expected during the month, number of calls expected out of office hours, number of support calls expected out of office hours. How many calls are basically like expected out of office hours? So that means that if the system is not very widely used out of office hours, so still you're getting calls. So you can measure it, like basically you are defining a measure so that once the application is up and running, you can see that whether the system is used out of office hours and how many such issues are coming. So and another factor for checking the supportability is response time for critical calls. What would be the response time for critical calls or critical transactions? For critical transactions, response time for high priority calls, high priority calls, response time for low priority calls. Again, these things are SLAs for the application. When the support team is responding, how do you get these SLAs, service level agreement? So based on what we define. So while the sales team is selling the product to the customer, we define these SLAs. We define these SLAs. Our sales team, support team is quick enough. If there is a high priority issue or critical issue, we will respond in 4 hours, or we will resolve it in 4 hours. If it is a medium priority or high priority issue, which will take 24 hours, something like that. So so those numbers would be arrived from these requirements, supportability related requirements, the supportability related requirements. And coming to the scalability, supportability also somewhere in a different measure. So which talks about the scalability of the application, which talks about percentage increase in yearly volumes for next 6 years, percentage increase in next yearly volumes for next 6 years, percentage increase in the number of users for next 6 years, number of users would be using the system, and percentage increase in disk space required yearly for next 6 years, percentage increase in the disk space required for next 6 years, required for next 6 years. So that means that every year on year, the number of branches will increase, the volumes will increase, the number of users will increase, the percentage disk space required for year. So how much scalable our systems are, how scalable our systems are, that will also talk about the supportability. When our customer is buying our application, so they would be asking that, okay, year on year, I'll have 20% increase in the number of users. and 10% like 40% increase in the transactions. So the system is capable to handle those things. The system is capable of handling those things. So that question the customer may come up with. So those things can be answered by having these metrics earlier as part of your requirement. So how scalable our systems are going forward? How do we scale up like year on year? How do we support the application in terms of the various priority issues, high priority, critical priority, and medium priority issues? Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Moving on to one of the other non-functional requirement, that is security of the application. The business need says that the protect sensitive information from unauthorized people accessing the application. The objective is confidentiality and integrity, so which talks about one of the objectives. So the system is protected from unauthorized access. So that means that you have the user ID login, proper mechanism, so that the system is basically accessible only for the authorized people who are having proper accounts. Availability also talks about time to restore, clean, restart, compromise system or the data. Time to restore, clean, restart, compromise system or the data. So the availability talks about how to restore the data, how to clean, restart, compromise system or the data. For example, you are trying to transfer the funds and the system goes down. The system goes down. Again, there is a security factor involved. So basically, it's more than the availability. There is a security factor. Time to restore, clean. So whenever the system is again brought back, so cleaning of that system and restart compromise system or the data. Compromise system or the data. So that basically talks about the availability of the application. When we talk about the compliance with regulations and industry standards, compliance with regulations and ISO standards. The system basically, with regards to security, we don't basically need to put it in a separate thing. Basically, for every application in every industry, there are standards defined. ISO standards are like other standards that are already defined. So if your system is compliant with those standards, that should be enough. If the system is compliant with those standards with regards to security, that should be mostly be enough. So that way, when you talk about the security, it talks about confidentiality of the information, the accessibility and access controls, availability, how the system can be restored and restart the compromised data, and compliance with the regulations and industry standards. Compliance with the regulations and industry standards. So that's about the security of the application. Now, the most important thing is that there will be n number of functional requirements, n number of non-functional requirements. So it is very difficult to uh, to consider all the non-functional requirements for every functional requirement. It is very difficult to implement as well. So how do we understand for which functional requirement, for each functional requirement, what are all the non-functional requirements which are important? What are all the non-functional requirements that are important? For example, information submission screen. So for example, in the software application, you have a screen where you can submit the information, or information submission screen. The user should be able to launch the application. And for example, job portal, the candidate should be able to enter all the information like employment, education, personal details. So that is information submission screen. On the x-axis, you have the usability, reliability, performance, supportability, security, and internationalization. On the right-hand side, usability, reliability, performance, supportability, security, and internationalization. With regards to information submission screen, out of these non-functional requirements, what are all the things which are very important? So obviously, information submission screen is where the user would be submitting the information. So coming to the user friendliness, if you are submitting the details, the system should be user friendly. You should know what each field is all about. So that is going to be a high priority item. That is going to be a high priority item with regards to the usability. And the performance also, with regards to performance information, like let's say there are 5 pages of information that needs to be filled in. For example, there needs to be, like, we need to fill in 5 pages of information. So if you want to fill in 5 pages of information, you expect the system to be fast enough, and otherwise what will happen, the user will not be interested to enter the details. You'll lose your business, right? So that's where, like, with regards to information submission screen, usability is very important, performance is very important, and all the other requirements are, like, there are some other things which may be important but not very much important compared to this thing. So that's why, like, for information submission screen, we make sure we handle these non-functional requirements properly. While making the payment, while you doing funds transfer or making the payment for any transaction, what is very important, the security is very important. So that is why H with a red background defines high priority. So we need to make sure the systems are going to handle these things properly. So while making the payment, the security becomes the high priority. The security of the things becomes high priority. And generating the report for the transaction. So generating the EOD report or like weekly report or whatever. With regards to that, none of these non-functional requirements are very important. Usability, not very much looked at, though it is H with no background. Reliability and performance is not very much needed. Supportability, kind of, you don't need to worry about so much of reporting stuff, and that to support activities would not be impacted by that. Security and installation, again, with less importance. So the usability is one of the things that we need to consider. That means that whatever the report that is generated, that should be user friendly, that should be readable format and stuff. Okay, so that way, by creating this type of spreadsheet, identifying your functional requirements and identifying the most important non-functional requirement, you create something of this sort would give you the understanding that, okay, with regards to the functionalities, what are the non-functional requirements which are quite important for us, what are the non-functional requirements which are quite important for us. So we'll have a understanding of those things. Is that clear?
Yes.
Right. So moving on to who will benefit from defining the non-functional requirement. Ultimately, everyone in the organization, the business, the management team, the architect team, the development team, the testing team, the infrastructure team, and the operations team. So how does the business would get benefited? By tracing the non-functional requirements once the application is up and running. You can trace your non-functional requirement with the system behavior, as I mentioned already. And the management team, so based on your identification of non-functional requirement, your CPU capacities or the system capacities can be planned, so which will help, so which can be planned in advance, which will help in cost saving and financial planning. It will help in cost saving and financial planning. The architect team in defining the right architecture and capacity planning, the development team in designing and development of the application, testing team in defining the test cases. If you have the requirements ready, you can basically, the testing team can define the test cases effectively and test the things effectively. Infrastructure team in provisioning the right infrastructure. Operations team in meeting their service level agreement and meeting the service level agreement. So that way, by defining the non-functional requirement, so everyone would be getting benefited by defining these things. Everyone who is part of the SDLC workflow, they would get benefited by defining these non-functional requirements. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So that's about the non-functional requirements. As I said, so as the time passes, these non-functional requirements have become very important. So nowadays, the competition is not on the functionalities, so which are anyway can be copied. So, but when it comes to non-functional requirements, every application has its own advantages and disadvantages. So identifying what non-functional requirements are very important for the application, handling those non-functional requirements as part of the development activity. So that becomes an important part of the application development activity. And also we should be able to um, segregate and define the importance of non-functionalities in relation with the functionalities, in relation to the functionalities, as I have shown you the spreadsheet few slides back. Okay, any questions?
I have a question. If the functional and non-functional requirement change depends on the system, as you said, for the banking system, the generational reports is a non-functional requirement, right? But if the system is developed to generate the report for the bills or something like for the employees, their employees' salary bill, that was a system, then that is the functional requirement, right?
Yes, that's a functional requirement.
Okay.
So what we try to do with that spreadsheet is, for each functional requirement, if you have to list down those non-functional requirements, and if you want to accomplish, it may not be possible. That is what I want to say. That is not possible at all. So
Okay.
that's where one important thing that we need to do is, we need to make sure for each functional requirement, what are all the non-functional requirements which are important? What are all the non-functional requirements which are important?
Okay.
That understanding we need to come up with. So that's where I've shown you that spreadsheet. We create all the functionalities on one side, like report generation, making the payment, and information submission, raising a help desk ticket, or maybe a claim process, or booking a flight ticket. So all the functionalities you put on one side, and the major non-functional requirement you put on the other side, like performance, security, user friendliness, availability of the application, and all that.
Okay.
And for each functional requirement, ask the question to the stakeholders, your own people, that what are the non-functional requirements which are important for this functionality. Okay, so based on that, you proceed with creating a spreadsheet, so making sure high priority, critical priority, and so on. So while developing the application, so while developing that particular functionality, based on this particular spreadsheet, the development team will be concentrating on the performance, the user friendliness. For example, information submission screen is being developed, and there is a username and password field. So password has to be having a particular format. So the moment the user trying to enter the password, if they're unable to enter the correct the correct format password, there should be some sample password that should be showing up there, numbers, numeric values, and then the special characters and so on. So that becomes user friendly. So that is where, by identifying these requirements, by able to put a spreadsheet something like this, so it is going to be easier for tracking these things going forward in terms of the development activity and subsequent activities. Is that clear?
Yeah. Okay. One more question. Do we ask about the non-functional requirement to the business owner too, or just a product owner, the project manager and the development team?
Not exactly. See, the project manager and development team would vary depending upon the type of organization you work, right? You work for a service-based organization. Your project manager is the one who would be like would be working more as a moderator between your client and your technology team. Okay, they don't have too much of the powers to influence the project. But if you're working for a product based organization and you have a project manager, then your influence is going to be more, because it's your own product and you are the project manager for that. Obviously you can take your own decisions. It is not, you need not to answer to a different organization, though you answer to your management team. That's where they'll have different influential levels. But again, defining the non-functional requirements, it's like any other functional requirement, the all the stakeholders would be participating in it. If it is our own product, our own management team will take up the call. If it is someone's product, we are working for that their product, they have to define their own non-functional requirements.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, so another important topic that we are going to talk about. So I hope this is not covered yet, right? The requirement traceability. Did we talk about this one?
No.
No, we've not.
Okay. So the requirement traceability. So in the requirement engineering field, the traceability is all about understanding how high-level requirements, that is objectives, goals, aims, aspirations, expectations, are transformed into low-level requirements. It is therefore primarily concerned with the relationship between the layers of the information. It is therefore primarily concerned with the relationship between the layers of the information. So that means that when we talk about the traceability is all about so understanding how high level objectives, aims, aspirations, and expectations are transformed into low level requirements. It is therefore primarily concerned with the relationship between the layers of the information. Primarily concerned with the relationship between the layers of the information. So when we talked about the requirement management or the requirement change management, I have mentioned that the requirement traceability is going to be important. Traceability is nothing but what? So your requirements at whatever the levels of information may be, we need to be able to track these requirements until the closure, until the implementation. So whatever shape it takes, we need to be able to track it. Why? The reason being, if any change happens to the requirement, all the subsequent layers of the information needs to be updated. All the subsequent layers of the information needs to be updated. The requirement traceability is all about preventing the scope creep. For every project, the scope is defined. In order to prevent the scope creep, so you need to have the traceability. Scope creep is nothing but what? For example, there is a requirement which is not connected to any business requirement, or there is a use case which is not connected to any functional requirement or a business requirement. That's when we can right away say that, okay, this is out of scope because it is not connected to any business requirement. So that way, by having traceability, it helps in preventing the scope creep. Ensure the quality product. So how do we ensure? The traceability is not only for the requirement, it will be also there for the test scenarios and test cases. That means that for each requirement, what are the test scenarios that we have? What are the test cases that we have? So to that extent, things will be connected so that you make sure that for every requirement, there is a test case defined. For every requirement, there is a test case defined. So by doing so, you ensure the quality product. You ensure the quality product. Then facilitate change control, as I mentioned already. The traceability is all about how do you handle the changes, because if you change a requirement, it will impact in one or more requirement changes. It can impact the other requirements. So how do you handle those changes? How do you handle that information? By having the traceability. Assist in prioritization and future planning. So basically, when you're doing the prioritization, you can identify the dependency by having the traceability. The ability to describe and follow the life of a requirement in both forward and backward direction, that is from its origins through the development and specification to its subsequent deployment and use, and through the periods of ongoing refinement and iteration in any of the phases. So basically, the traceability is all about the ability to describe okay so the ability to describe and follow the life of a requirement in both forward and backward direction from its origin through its development and specification, and through the periods of ongoing requirement and iteration of any of these phases. So we maintain the traceability of the things. So for maintaining the traceability, so we need something called as traceability metrics. We need something known as traceability metrics. What does traceability metrics is all about? It associates the business and the functional requirements with the use cases and test scripts that will be used to validate them. That will be used to validate them. It associates the business and functional requirements with the use cases and test scripts. So that means that traceability metrics associate business requirements, functional requirement with use cases and test scripts, ensures the completeness of testing and provides the basis for test planning activity. By looking at the traceability metrics, you can make sure that whether all the requirements are getting tested or not. And if at all, if there is any requirement which is not being tested, so you can identify it and you can make sure you have the coverage. Can be a standalone document or part of the requirement document or for the test plan. So basically, it can be a standalone document or it can be a part of any other documentation. Change control: when a business requirement changes or changes its priority, it can be identified and updated easily throughout all the documentation. This is very important aspect. When a business requirement changes or changes its priority, it can be identified and updated throughout all the documentation by having a traceability matrix. If you have a traceability matrix, it is easy to link up these things. It is easy to link up these things. Now, if you look at the traceability matrix example, the relationship of a driver to a satisfier, that is a use case or test script, can be one to one or one to many or many to one. So many to one generally won't happen. In general, the relationship of a driver to the satisfier, it can be one to one or one to many. So what does that mean? One business requirement gives rise to one functional requirement, or one business requirement gives rise to multiple functional requirements. Multiple functional requirements. So that's where we can say one to one, like the relationship, or one to many relationship, or one to many relationship. Traceability requires unique identifier for each requirement and use case or test script. So for each level of information, a unique identifiers are needed. Unique identifiers are needed. So each business requirement decomposed into smallest packages assigned a unique identifier. So for each business requirement, you will have a unique identifier like BR001, 002, 003, etc. Each business requirement will have one or more functional requirement, and if you want to like make sure you identify the requirement properly, you put you connectivity properly, you put the unique references like FR001.01, 001.02, which says that this particular functionality is derived from BR001. These functionalities are derived from BR001. So that way you can establish a relationship between the business requirement and the subsequent layers of the information like the functional requirements. Now this is a traceability matrix, so this gives you a better understanding. The first one, the first line talks about the user needs. RU1 and RU2 are the user needs, for example. And the second one, the definition says that the business requirements, we are aligning with the business requirement, which has RD1 and RD2, which has RD1 and RD2. And the third one is about the specification, the requirement specification, which has RS1, RS2, RS3, etc. RS1, RS2, RS3, etc. So design module and code module, forget about it. That's not very much of interest for us. So test plan, so we will consider that as a test scenario where you have TP1, TP2, TP3, TP4, TP5, and 6. And you have the corresponding test cases. So you have the user needs, you have the business requirements, you have the functional requirements, you have the test scenarios, you have the test cases. Now we take an example of a RD1 functional requirement. RD1 as a functional requirement. Now RD1 has RD1 as a business requirement has two functional requirement, RS1 and RS2. RD1 has two functional requirement, RS1 and RS2. Now RS1 has one test scenario or test plan, that is TP1. RS1 has one test scenario, that is basically the test scenario 1 or TP1, and one test case which is called as TC1, which is TC1. RS1 has TP1 and TC1. TP1 and TC1. While you see RS2 has TC2, TC3, TC4, TC5, and TC6. So that means that, sorry, RS2 has TP2, TP3, TP4, TP5. Four, like four function, the test scenarios: TP2, TP3, TP4, and TP5. And subsequently, you have 5 test cases: TC2, TC3, TC4, TC5, and TC6. These are the 5 test cases that you have. So that way, when you talk about the traceability metrics, you have this connectivity. So, for example, your RS2 gets changed. What would be the impact? Your TP2, TP3, TP4, TP5 needs to be updated. Your test case is TC2, TC3, TC4, TC5, TC6 needs to be updated, because these are all derived from RS2. And your RD1 may need to be modified if the change is so much that your business requirement may need to be modified or corrected. Your business requirement may need to be modified or corrected. If the change is so much that you need to modify those things as well. So that way, by having the traceability, you make sure that for each requirement you have a test case or not. That's one thing. If there is a change in one of the requirement, what is the impact of it on the other layers of the information? That can be identified. By having a traceability matrix. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay, so in summary, the traceability matrix, the requirement traceability, assist in quality solutions. How does assist in quality solution? Obviously, by making sure each and every requirement is getting tested. The traceability allows for greater control of inevitable changes during the project. The greater control of inevitable changes during the project. So, in the project life cycle, the changes can be possible. The traceability allows for greater control of these changes. Enterprise traceability proves alignment with the business goals. The enterprise traceability proves alignment with the business goals. What does that mean? Again, the organizational traceability. For every organization, it has its own objectives and goals. So it is in line with whatever the business goals you have, or the projects in the organization are in line with whatever the goals that the organization have. So the traceability is there everywhere, but with regards to the requirement traceability, this is how we create metrics, something like this, and maintain. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So that's about the requirement traceability and whatever that is now the non-functional requirements as part of the today's session. So tomorrow we're going to talk about the Jira tool. So did we talked about the tool? I think we talked about the tool, right?
We
The
haven't
Jira
talked
tool.
A little bit
we have little
on
bit.
when you talk about agile, that time you talk a little bit about
Okay,
the
okay. So the Jira tool, we will have the discussion, and if anyone can install a trial version, or if you have a Jira tool, I can show you how to use it. I don't have it with me right now, and the trial version also got expired. I have it in like my other system, but that cannot be accessible. So if anyone can try downloading the trial version or any previous version, I can show you how to use it. That's one thing. Otherwise, I can walk you through how the Jira tool and what are the major aspects of the tool, so that we can go through those things. And the next one in tomorrow's session, so we'll be talking about the querying part. So we will talk about SQL queries to get the data from the database, to what extent we use the querying part. So we will be having a discussion of that tomorrow and day after. And then we will talk about the sample project study. So with that, mostly we should be done with most of the part, like the other questionnaire and stuff. That would be a later part of it. Okay, is that clear?
Yes.
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 Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, and see you tomorrow. Bye bye.